Josephine Baker's life was so full of twists, triumphs, heartbreaks, and surprises that at times it almost feels like she lived several different lifetimes. Born Frida Josephine McDonald on June 3, 1906 in St. Louis, Missouri, she later became famous around the world as Josephine Baker, a legendary performer, a fearless civil rights activist, and a pioneering example of how sheer determination can overcome overwhelming obstacles. While many people know her as the dazzling Black Pearl who took 1920s Paris by storm and danced in exotic costumes, the layers beneath her public persona are far richer. From her earliest days of street performances and heartbreakingly early marriages, to the heights of superstardom in Europe, to her stint as a World War II spy, and on to her final triumphant bow on stage just days before her death, Baker's story remains as captivating as it is complex. In a time that too often constrained Black women to marginal roles, Josephine Baker insisted on taking center stage, dancing and singing her way into the hearts of audiences across the globe. She was born into a family for whom performance was already something of a calling, even if they struggled financially. Her father, Eddie Carson, was reportedly a vaudeville drummer who picked up gigs around St. Louis to make ends meet, and her mother, Carrie McDonald, worked as a laundress, although some later accounts suggest Carrie herself might have been a nimble dancer who gave up performing once the family's economic challenges set in. Regardless of which version is accurate, little Josephine was essentially immersed in music from the time she was an infant, and there's a popular story that she took to the stage at just 1 year old during one of her parents' performances. Obviously, she wouldn't have had any idea she was performing then, but it's still a symbol of how seamlessly show business integrated into her life. Those early days in St. Louis were anything but glamorous, though. Josephine sometimes danced on street corners for spare change, and poverty loomed over the household. She left school long before finishing 6th grade, drifting toward the entertainment world, but also living in precarious conditions. At one point, she reportedly slept in cardboard boxes and scrounged for food. She saw a lot of cruelty as a child, not only from the overt racism that saturated Missouri during that era, but also from certain employers who treated her with shocking brutality. In one disturbing account, the white mistress of the house where she did laundry burned Josephine's hands when the child accidentally used too much soap. These painful experiences forged in her a deep mistrust of people who wielded power and an empathy for the vulnerable, especially for wounded animals, which she often tried to care for with all the tenderness that was denied her. At a shockingly young age, Josephine tried to find stability in marriage. She was just 13 when she wed Willie Wells, although the marriage fell apart within a year. By 15, she had married again, this time to Willie Baker. Though that marriage would also not last, she ended up keeping the surname Baker for the rest of her career, presumably because by the time it ended, she had started to gain a reputation as a promising dancer. It's sobering to think that while still a child herself, she was juggling adult relationships, poverty, and the early seeds of an entertainment career that would eventually consume her entire life. Josephine's first big break came in the context of the Harlem Renaissance. Eager to escape poverty, she moved north and eventually auditioned for musical revues such as Shuffle Along. Initially, the producers deemed her too skinny and too dark, reflecting the colorism and body type prejudices of the time. Yet Josephine, who was known even then for her ability to adapt and persevere, found a way in. She worked as a dresser, quietly learning all the choreography, waiting for a chance. When a cast member dropped out, Josephine stepped up. She had a unique dance style that involved comedic expressions At first, she'd pretend not to know the choreography, entertaining the audience with mistakes, only to burst out with flawless moves by the encore. Audiences loved her energy, her sense of humor, and her onstage charm. Her star began a slow but noticeable ascent. While she did gain some success as a chorus girl on Broadway and in vaudeville, the United States at that time was deeply segregated. Josephine still faced constant discrimination, not only from mainstream audiences, but at times even from other black performers who might have seen her as too eccentric. Hungry for a broader acceptance, she turned her eyes abroad. In 1925, she traveled to Paris to perform, and the City of Light, famous for its jazz clubs, avant-garde art scene, and cultural openness, at least compared to the U.S., quickly embraced her. Practically overnight, Josephine Baker became the toast of Paris. That explosive success meant she decided to leave America behind. In Paris, people were enthralled by her blend of comedic antics and provocative dance moves. While some critics in more conservative circles called her exotic, improper, or even lewd, she saw her performances as an expression of joyful abandon. She danced in skirts made of feathers or bananas. One of her most iconic images involves her dancing in a banana skirt in the Folies Bergère Revue, but there was more to her popularity than novelty. She exuded a palpable sense of fun, boldness, and spontaneity. Among her admirers were cultural heavyweights like Pablo Picasso, who tried to capture her energy in sketches, and Jean Cocteau, who wanted her to star in films. The French public loved her enough to make her into a major movie star, the first African-American woman to land a lead role in a feature film, Siren of the Tropics, in 1927. For a time, she was rumored to be the wealthiest black woman in the world, earning huge sums for her stage shows while living in a lavish apartment, adopting exotic pets, and throwing legendary parties. Yet, as history often reminds us, good fortune in the 1920s soon gave way to the ominous 1930s. The golden glow she experienced in Paris wouldn't always follow her across Europe. On a tour stop in Vienna in 1928, Josephine was confronted by bigoted posters labeling her a black devil, warning the public to stay away from her shows. It was a harbinger of the rising racial intolerance that would soon envelop much of the continent as fascism spread. World War II then descended on Europe, and Josephine responded in a way that few expected. She became an undercover agent for the French resistance. Having gained French citizenship in 1937 through her third marriage to French industrialist Jean Lion, Josephine felt a deep loyalty to France. When war broke out, she used her touring schedule as a cover, smuggling intelligence from one country to another and passing along coded messages. This was a remarkable risk, especially for a woman whose public persona was that of a carefree performer. In reality, she was hiding weapons in her chateau, harboring refugees, and hosting clandestine gatherings. When German forces became suspicious, she charmed them with her hospitality, completely hiding the fact that a number of French resistance members were taking shelter on her property. She even resorted to clever tricks like writing secret notes in invisible ink on her sheet music. Later, she'd recall that because she was Josephine Baker, no one thought to question these innocent pages of musical notation. Her remarkable wartime service earned her some of France's highest honors, including the Croix de Guerre and the Medal of the Resistance. For an American-born entertainer to receive these accolades was extraordinary, but she had earned them through considerable risk to her own life. This sense of moral and political commitment carried over into her relationship with the civil rights movement in the United States. Though she felt a strong allegiance to her adopted country, she also never forgot what it meant to be a black woman from St. Louis. In 1963, She was the only woman to speak on stage at the March on Washington, standing alongside Martin Luther King Jr. She famously wore her Free French uniform and addressed the crowd about the power of unity. After King's assassination, Coretta Scott King personally asked Josephine whether she might be willing to assume a leadership role in the civil rights movement. Baker ultimately declined, citing concern for her many adopted children. She wanted to keep them safe. Those children were the famous Rainbow Tribe, a group of 12 children of different nationalities and ethnicities whom Josephine adopted beginning in the late 1940s. She had dreams of creating a living demonstration that people of different backgrounds could coexist peacefully. In her mind, this was a symbolic family that would serve as an example to the rest of the world. She bought a large estate called Château de Miland in southwestern France, where she raised her children among a veritable menagerie of exotic pets, including monkeys, goats, and her beloved cheetah. On the surface, it might have seemed a whimsical, almost fairy tale lifestyle, but years later, some of her children, particularly her son Jean-Claude Baker, revealed that their upbringing wasn't always the utopia the public thought it was. Jean-Claude described feeling like Josephine was more enthralled with the idea of them as a human doll collection than as individual children with their own needs. Meanwhile, another adopted son, Akio, recalled her with affection, saying that she was a great artist and mother at heart, but also acknowledging that no parent is perfect. Despite her deep ties to France, Baker tried repeatedly to find acceptance back in her native United States, but she faced even harsher racism there than she did in Europe, particularly in the 1930s and 1950s. One especially bitter chapter took place in 1936, when she became the first black woman to star in the famous Ziegfeld Follies. While that should have been a triumphant moment in her career, critics wrote scathing racist reviews and audiences were hostile. Meanwhile, hotels often turned her away, a humiliating reminder that in her birthplace, she was seen as less than equal despite her global fame. Even as late as the 1950s, she'd face multiple hotel rejections whenever she returned to the U.S. She also clashed with certain American clubs that demanded segregated seating for black patrons. In a move that was bold for its time, Josephine Baker refused to perform unless the venue integrated. She turned down a $10,000 offer from a Miami club rather than compromise her principles, and eventually the club gave in, hosting its first non-segregated show. Soon after, entire cities like Las Vegas started integrating, at least partially, in response to Baker's firm stand. Josephine Baker's steadfast refusal to tolerate discrimination frequently attracted both profound respect and fierce criticism, especially in the United States. One of the most illustrative examples of this clash took place in October 1951 at Manhattan's storied Stork Club, an upscale nightclub on East 53rd Street, renowned for drawing in celebrities, socialites, and political figures. The Stork Club was owned by Sherman Billingsley and was known as one of the most exclusive night spots in the city. If you found yourself on its guest list, you'd made it in high society. Yet for all its glitz and glamour, it was also a place that upheld the era's entrenched racial biases. On the night in question, Baker, already an international star who had dazzled audiences in Paris, performed on Broadway, and garnered global attention, was refused service by the waitstaff. Accounts differ on whether they deliberately ignored her or outright told her they would not serve her, but the snub was undeniably fueled by racial prejudice. Hollywood star Grace Kelly, who was at the Stork Club the same evening, observed the blatant discrimination happening right in front of her. Kelly, still a rising actress at that point, she wouldn't marry Prince Rainier III of Monaco until 1956, was appalled. She reportedly exclaimed, "This is ridiculous. I'm leaving with you," and promptly stood up to leave, insisting that Baker come along. Several witnesses noted that Kelly wasn't alone in her anger. Some from her circle followed suit, leaving the venue in solidarity with Josephine. That moment would become not only a dramatic symbol of protest against racism, but also the beginning of an unshakable bond between the two women. This spontaneous act of allyship made headlines, drawing further attention to the United States' pervasive racial injustices. Baker, who had already made headlines by refusing to perform in segregated venues, felt validated and moved by Kelly's reaction. It was a public demonstration that some prominent white figures were willing to take a stand, even if it meant walking out of a famous New York institution. In the aftermath, the media spotlight shone on the Stork Club, raising uncomfortable questions about its practices. While the club tried to downplay the incident, the damage to its reputation in certain circles had been done. Stories circulated that the management was notorious for discouraging or denying service to Black patrons, especially if they were not accompanied by influential white clientele. Even though Josephine was globally revered, her skin color effectively nullified her star power in the eyes of some. Following the Stork Club incident, Baker and Kelly quickly developed a friendship that went far beyond that single evening. Their personalities on the surface might have seemed worlds apart. Josephine was a flamboyant, outspoken entertainer who had seen the worst of poverty, racism, and war. Grace Kelly was a refined Hollywood star known for her poised, almost regal demeanor, a style that director Alfred Hitchcock famously praised. Yet both women shared a sense of empathy and a willingness to defy norms in their own ways. Their rapport deepened over the next few years, with each showing admiration for the other's journey. Kelly would often describe Baker's life story as nothing short of heroic, referring not only to her performances but also to her involvement in the French Resistance during World War II and her civil rights work. Josephine Baker's friendship with Grace Kelly took on a new level of urgency once Baker's lavish home, Chateau de Miland, slipped beyond her financial grasp. By the mid-1960s, Baker was confronting a perfect storm of monetary troubles that threatened not only her day-to-day stability but also the overarching dream she had nurtured for years. A central piece of that dream was her Rainbow Tribe, a term she coined for the 12 children of different ethnicities she had adopted in the late 1940s and 1950s. Baker yearned to prove to the world, especially to observers of different racial and cultural backgrounds, that peaceful coexistence was possible under one roof. She set about raising these children in an expansive estate in the Dordogne region of southwestern France, believing that Chateau de Milan could serve as both a family home and a living symbol of multicultural harmony. Chateau de Milan was originally built in the late 15th century and had been renovated over the centuries, featuring whimsical towers and sprawling grounds that captured Baker's imagination. She acquired it around 1947, determined to transform it into a personal oasis. It soon came to host not just her adoptive children, but also a small menagerie of exotic pets, a testament to Baker's penchant for collecting animals that needed care or that fascinated her. Reports mention cheetahs, monkeys, goats, and more, creatures she introduced to her estate as part of the showmanship and warmth she had become famous for on stage. Beyond housing her children and animals, Baker also attempted to convert Chateau de Miland into a tourist attraction. She opened sections of it to the public, allowing visitors to watch her Rainbow Tribe go about their daily routines, and sometimes put on small performances or interactive sessions with the animals. While this might have been financially motivated, it was also consistent with Baker's flair for spectacle, a way to share her vision of unity with paying audiences. In practice, however, this drew mixed reactions. Some visitors saw it as a remarkable testament to Baker's idealism, while others were uncomfortable with what they perceived as the children's privacy being compromised for public display. Regardless, the revenue from these tours and occasional events was never enough to offset the estate's immense upkeep costs. Maintaining a centuries-old chateau in the French countryside required constant resources. There were repairs to the building's historic structures, salaries for staff members who assisted with housekeeping, gardening, child care, and animal care, plus ongoing renovations to modernize aspects of the property. On top of these expenses, Baker regularly donated to humanitarian causes and invested in philanthropic ventures aligned with her civil rights advocacy. While these projects cemented her reputation as a compassionate figure, they also drained her finances at a rapid rate. The situation grew precarious in the early to mid-1960s as performance opportunities became less frequent, especially the high-paying ones that had once filled theaters in Europe and abroad. Baker's lifestyle, shaped by years of stardom, was another contributing factor. During her heyday in Paris in the 1920s and 30s, she had become used to grand gestures and luxurious surroundings. Even as popular tastes shifted and competition intensified, she found it difficult to scale back, partly because her estate and adopted family had become symbols of her life's mission. Each time she traveled for concerts, be they in France, the U.S., or elsewhere, she spent large sums to keep her estate running smoothly in her absence. By 1969, her financial predicament had reached a breaking point. Creditors who had initially extended loans or allowed delayed payments now demanded repayment. Legal proceedings ensued, and despite Baker's passionate attempts to raise money via benefit concerts or personal appeals to friends and fans, she could not halt the foreclosure. The repossession of Chateau de Miland was devastating not only because of its physical grandeur, but because it represented a profound ideological defeat. The estate had been the nucleus of her vision for a family that transcended racial and cultural divides. Losing it meant relinquishing the very experiment that she hoped would inspire the broader world toward tolerance and acceptance. Amid the heartbreak of eviction, Baker's emotional distress was palpable. Contemporaneous news accounts and statements from her close confidants describe a woman who fought to the last minute to preserve her home, staging fundraising events and even reaching out to wealthy patrons who had once admired her. Yet no lifeline was substantial enough to cover the deepening debt. In August 1969, she was forced to vacate the premises. Photographs from that period depict her in tears, cradling some of her children, while onlookers and press reporters crowded around. It was in this dark hour that Grace Kelly, Princess Grace of Monaco, demonstrated the depth of her allegiance to Baker. The two women had become friends in 1951, when Kelly famously walked out of the Stork Club in New York after witnessing Baker being refused service because of her race. In the intervening years, they maintained an affectionate relationship, exchanging letters and visiting when their schedules aligned. By the time Baker lost Chateau de Milan, Princess Grace had solidified her status in Monaco and had considerable influence over housing, permits for performances, and financial connections within the principality. Moved by Baker's plight, she offered her a place to stay in Monaco. This gesture was not merely symbolic. It gave Baker a stable address and an environment where she could perform occasionally to pay her bills and care for the remaining children under her responsibility. Monaco, known for its luxurious setting on the French Riviera, became a refuge that allowed Baker to salvage some dignity. Although far from the sprawling estate she had once presided over, her new accommodations at least provided security. She was able to perform in select venues, both in Monaco and elsewhere, to generate enough income to maintain a semblance of her former life. The arrangement also underscored the contrast between the rejection Baker faced from mainstream American institutions and the welcoming environment she continued to find in certain European circles, particularly among individuals like Grace Kelly, who recognized Baker's achievements and valued her as a friend. The end of Château de Miland as Baker's home did not erase its significance in her life story. Even after leaving, she spoke fondly of her days there, albeit with tinges of regret at how circumstances forced her hand. Some of her adopted children had to find new living arrangements, while others stayed under her care in a scaled-down household. Over time, the chateau itself changed owners and eventually became a public attraction commemorating Baker's legacy. Today, visitors can view exhibits about her career, her role in the French Resistance, and her ambitious Rainbow Tribe project, all testament to the years she dedicated to making the estate a beacon of cultural harmony. In the broader arc of Baker's life, the loss of Château de Milan symbolizes both her greatest aspiration and a moment of crushing defeat. It was the physical embodiment of her dream to show that racial differences need not divide families or communities. Yet the financial strain of running an expansive estate and raising a large multiracial family revealed the gap between her idealism and the harsh realities of sustaining such a venture. That Grace Kelly stepped in at precisely this moment reflected not just personal kindness, but also a profound respect for Baker's legacy. It sent a message that Baker's contributions to entertainment, to civil rights, and even to wartime efforts were not to be forgotten, even when her fortunes waned. The entire episode echoes a recurring theme in Josephine Baker's life. Her unwavering commitment to unity and freedom often clashed with socio-economic barriers and the prejudices of her era. Yet in losing her chateau, she found a different kind of refuge through the loyalty of a friend, proving once more that while her grand visions might sometimes falter in the face of financial hardship, her ability to inspire compassion and admiration endured until her final days. By the late 1960s, Josephine Baker had become mired in a spiral of financial strain. Her cherished estate, Château de Miland, located in the Dordogne region of southwestern France, had once been a symbol of her grand ambitions. There, she had raised her Rainbow Tribe, a group of children from various ethnic backgrounds, whom she hoped would serve as a living example of racial harmony and unity. Yet the costs of maintaining a chateau, feeding and educating a large family, plus her ongoing philanthropic pursuits, proved overwhelming. In 1969, with debts mounting and creditors pressing, Baker was forced to relinquish Château de Miland altogether, a devastating blow that not only robbed her of her home, but also struck at the heart of her vision for a multicultural utopia. It was at this darkest juncture that Grace Kelly, now Princess Grace of Monaco, intervened in a manner that underscored the depth of her friendship with Baker. The two had first bonded in 1951 at New York's Stork Club, when Kelly stood up for Baker following a racist snub by the establishment. Over the ensuing years, they kept in touch and developed a deep mutual respect. By the time Baker lost her French estate, Princess Grace had considerable influence and financial means through her royal position in Monaco. Recognizing the severity of Baker's predicament, Kelly offered the performer a lifeline in the form of housing within the principality. Monaco, a tiny city-state perched on the French Riviera, was known for its luxurious casinos, its glamorous Grand Prix, and its high-profile royal family. Securing an invitation to live or perform, there was no small gesture. It provided Baker not just shelter, but also a renewed sense of dignity. Having a stable base of operations meant she could still schedule occasional appearances, both in Monte Carlo and elsewhere, thus keeping her artistic career alive. Moreover, Monaco's geographical proximity to France gave Baker the option to remain near her fans, professional contacts, and adopted children, some of whom had scattered following the loss of the chateau. The apartment or villa that Princess Grace helped arrange allowed Baker to avoid the worst possible outcome, total destitution. While no longer living amidst the lavish splendor she once enjoyed, she retained enough stability to continue supporting her family and to stage concerts sporadically. Beyond the practical assistance, the support served as a powerful reminder that Baker was not forgotten. Her ties to Europe, reinforced through Kelly's generosity, were a testament to the friendships she had cultivated in her decades of stardom. The arrangement also highlighted Grace Kelly's personal ethos. She was determined to uphold compassion and moral responsibility as part of her role as a princess. Far from being a mere symbolic gesture, her help displayed a sincere commitment to protecting those she cared about, particularly a woman who had once endured the sting of racism and who had so often lent her own fame to support civil rights causes. Many of Baker's close associates later remarked that, if not for Kelly's timely intervention, Baker might have been forced to return to the United States, where she still encountered significant discrimination, or else risk homelessness and humiliation in France. Baker's life in Monaco, though not as lavish as her earlier years, enabled her to remain within a culture that had largely celebrated her talents and persona. She could continue performing when opportunities arose and hold on to her sense of artistic identity. For Grace Kelly, ensuring Baker's comfort in Monaco underscored how a single act of solidarity, like the one at the Stork Club years earlier, could blossom into an enduring, life-altering friendship. Their bond ultimately stood as a poignant example of how empathy, forged in moments of righteous indignation, can translate into practical support that changes a person's fate. Their friendship demonstrated how two women, each shaped by vastly different backgrounds, could find common ground in empathy, activism, and a shared sense of moral duty. For Baker, having someone of Kelly's stature champion her rights and well-being made a significant statement in the public eye, emphasizing that racial discrimination could be confronted not only by those who directly experienced it, but also by allies who recognized its injustice. For Kelly, extending help to Josephine was both an act of personal loyalty and an embodiment of the values she wished to project as a princess: grace, compassion, and the desire to uphold human dignity. Thus, a single refusal of service at the Stork Club ended up echoing far beyond the confines of an elite Manhattan hangout. It forged an unlikely sisterhood that lasted until Baker's final years, showcasing how a moment of indignation could blossom into a powerful alliance, one that underscored Grace Kelly's sense of justice and Josephine Baker's unwavering fight against discrimination. Josephine's personal life was as dramatic as her public one. She had multiple marriages and a long affair with her manager, Giuseppe Pepito Abatino, who was actually an Italian stonemason turned entrepreneur and had a significant hand in crafting her public image. He recognized how to shape Baker's brand, especially in Europe, turning her from a popular dancer into an international phenomenon. They also tried to open a nightclub called Chez Josephine, further cementing her star power. Tragically, while Baker was in the U.S. trying to revitalize her career, Abatino died of cancer without telling her of his illness. not wanting to distract her. Devastated by the loss, she turned to risky behaviors, among them learning to fly planes and taking up other daredevil pursuits to numb her grief. Her relationship with her mother, Carrie, remained complicated throughout her life. Although Baker often returned to St. Louis bearing gifts, money, and tokens of success, Carrie never seemed to approve of Josephine's career path. Scholars and biographers suggest that Carrie disliked her daughter's flamboyant showbiz life, believing it improper or doomed. That tension with her mother may have partly driven Josephine's decision to permanently relocate to France and pour all her love into her adoptive children. Amid the swirl of her performance schedule, activism, personal relationships, and motherhood, Baker also harbored a long list of rumored affairs, including high-profile relationships with women. It was an open secret in Parisian circles that Josephine had relationships with both men and women. One of the more famous, though still sometimes disputed, claims was that she had a fling with the Mexican surrealist painter Frida Kahlo, who traveled to Paris in 1939. Kahlo, known for her own bold persona and willingness to break boundaries, found a kinship in Baker. There's no definitive proof of the depth of their liaison, but it's widely repeated in various accounts that they had at least a brief romantic connection. Baker's rumored female lovers also included names like Colette, the famed French novelist, and possibly other high society figures. She wasn't particularly discreet about her bisexuality, though she also didn't broadcast it constantly. Rather, she let it stand as part of her persona, another dimension of her fearless self-expression. During and after World War II, Baker also used her fame for humanitarian causes. In addition to harboring refugees during the war, she raised funds for impoverished Parisians. Many recognized her altruistic spirit, and she received multiple decorations from the French government for her contributions during the occupation. After the war, she returned her attention to activism in the U.S. civil rights sphere, fully aware that racism persisted not just in her home country, but worldwide. Her stance of refusing to perform before segregated audiences forced some clubs to integrate. That alone stands as a significant achievement, especially given how many entertainers at the time might have felt compelled to compromise just to get paid. Yet even Josephine's unstoppable energy had limits. Over time, she encountered massive financial struggles. Maintaining the Chateau de Miland with her rainbow tribe, plus all her exotic pets, she had goats, monkeys, even a cheetah named Chiquita that once caused a stir by wandering into the orchestra pit, cost a fortune. She tried to keep the estate running by turning it into a tourist attraction, where people could watch her children's daily lives like some living diorama of international unity. Some visitors were charmed. Others were put off by what they saw as an exploitative spectacle. The revenue never really balanced the expenses, and by the late 1960s, Josephine faced bankruptcy. Eventually, in 1969, creditors took possession of the chateau. Baker was shattered at the loss of her dream estate. But once again, Grace Kelly swooped in to help, offering her a villa in Monaco so she would not be homeless. Even with these setbacks, Baker never fully quit performing. In 1975, at the age of 68, she staged a grand comeback in Paris to commemorate her 50 years in show business. The opening night was a star-studded affair. Sophia Loren, Mick Jagger, and other luminaries filled the audience. By all accounts, it was a triumphant return. Baker had spent weeks rehearsing, determined to show that she could still captivate. The reviews were glowing. Some called it one of the best performances of her life. Perhaps it was the final crown on her extraordinary career. Tragically, just 4 days later, she was found in her hotel room in a coma, having suffered a cerebral hemorrhage. Surrounding her hospital bed were positive critiques of her show, testament to the fact that she had left the stage on a high. Josephine Baker died on April the 12th, 1975. In a final gesture to her incredible bond with France, Baker received a full Roman Catholic funeral. Around 20,000 people turned out to pay respects, lining the streets of Paris as her procession passed by. She was given a 21-gun salute, the first American woman in France's history to receive such a military honor. However, she wasn't laid to rest in Paris. At the request and arrangement of Princess Grace, Josephine Baker was interred in Monaco. There, she was memorialized as an international star who had offered so much love, style, and service to her adopted land. Her legacy, as many describe it, is multifaceted. To some, she's primarily a pioneering entertainer who set the stage for artists like Beyoncé and Diana Ross, both of whom have referenced Baker's iconic banana skirt imagery or paid tribute to her style. To others, she's a hero of the French Resistance, a woman who risked her life in espionage and saved countless others by providing shelter and intel. Still others see her as an activist in civil rights, a performer who forced American venues to question the injustice of segregation. And of course, many remain intrigued by her personal life, the Rainbow Tribe, the rumored affairs, the lavish parties, the heartbreaks, and the controversies. She was undeniably complicated, at times abrasive, at times generous to a fault, at times naive in her financial dealings, and at times extremely cunning in matters of war and diplomacy. Baker's stance on identity was equally complex. She famously recorded a song called J'ai deux amours, I Have Two Loves, in which she declared that she loved both Paris and her native land of the USA. But critics and her biographer's son, Jean-Claude Baker, would note that this might have been a playful double entendre, suggesting that Baker was referencing her bisexuality. Two Loves was less about countries and more about sexual orientation. The layers of meaning in that single track demonstrate how Baker delighted in subtlety and performance. She loved creating an aura of mystique around herself. Decades after her death, Baker received yet another honor from the country that had embraced her so fully. In November 2021, it was announced that her symbolic remains, an urn containing soil from places significant to her life, would be inducted into the Pantheon in Paris, making her the first Black woman to receive that exalted tribute. The Pantheon is a mausoleum reserved for the heroes of the French nation, writers, scientists, statesmen, and other cultural luminaries. Inducting Josephine Baker was a posthumous recognition of her achievements, not only as an entertainer, but also as a decorated war hero and a civil rights champion. It was yet another testament to how profoundly she touched French history, so much so that she would occupy the same hallowed space as Victor Hugo, Marie Curie, and other giants of French heritage. Her adoption into the Pantheon underscores something fundamental. Josephine Baker may have grown up amid poverty and racism in the United States, but she reshaped her identity and found a place where her talents and contributions were revered. From the battered streets of St. Louis to the grand boulevards of Paris, from a rejected teenage chorus girl to a spy risking her life against Nazi occupation, from a woman scorned for her skin color in her own country to a beloved icon recognized with full military honors, Baker's life story is nothing short of extraordinary. Despite the contradictions, the controversies, and the tragedies, it's the sense of joy and freedom in her art that keeps her name alive today. She made her audiences laugh, gasp, and occasionally blush with her comedic expressions and unabashed dancing. She brought color and exuberance to a world that too often favored gray uniforms and rigid social hierarchies. Through her refusal to perform in segregated venues, she shone a spotlight on injustice. Through her espionage, she helped free countless individuals. Through her efforts to raise a rainbow tribe, she tried, however imperfectly, to embody the ideal of global unity. And in her final performance at the age of 68, she showed the world that her determination and love for the stage had never waned. It's easy to imagine her with a wide, mischievous smile, arms flung out, letting the music run through her, uniting everything that made her who she was. The little girl who once danced on St. Louis street corners, the glamorous star adored by Picasso, the loyal agent of the French Resistance, the unwavering civil rights supporter, and the adoptive mother to a diverse brood of children she believed would show the world how to love beyond boundaries. In truth, Josephine Baker's life ended with her having been many different things to many different people, but there is no doubt that she changed the world in her own dazzling way. Even now, her influence resonates in pop culture tributes and in the hearts of those who see her as a pioneer who transcended every limit placed upon her. The child who once faced colorism, poverty, and the cruelty of bigotry became a transcendent figure, known across continents, remembered both for her banana skirt performances and for the war medals pinned to her chest. In every sense, Josephine Baker stands as a testament to the power of believing in yourself, seizing opportunities, and never backing down from a fight, whether on a stage in a war or in the social arena of civil rights. She believed she could triumph, and she did. And for that, she will always be remembered as one of the most remarkable icons of the 20th century.